So because you then love Jesus for all that he has done for you, it just means that you're more than happy to obey him. It means that you want to obey him. It means that you want to do the things that he wants to do. And that was the very reason why the Bible says, or Jesus said, that his commandments are not heavy, they're not difficult. They're actually easy. And sometimes you look at that and you think, no, it's not. They're actually not that easy. But if we love him, he says, you will obey my commands, because people you love, you tend to listen to. People you love, you tend to respect. People you love, you tend to obey and do what pleases them. Now, there's a parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 7 that has always maybe not bothered me, but has always been a little bit of a question that I think in my mind. And I think it's worth us talking through this one a little bit. So in Luke chapter 7, from verse 36, we can have a bit of a read. Any one of you have the Bible, then you can join me in reading. You don't have. Do you have a Bible? No? Do you have? So you can join me then. Luke, I will read a little bit. So we'll read from 36 through to 50.
What am I looking for? Luke chapter 7.
Luke chapter 7.
Luke, who also wrote Acts.
Acts, indeed.
A prolific
Yeah.
New Testament writer, not as prolific as your homeboy Paul Saul.
Saul Paul.
Saul Paul.
John Paul. Okay, shall I read? And then, do you want to read the first few verses? You read as many as you feel you can, and then I'll
30.
take over. Just from 36.
36. Hey, I must have read this recently. It's all red.
You recognise it, do you?
Oh, red will be like Jesus speaking.
Is it? Oh, okay. That's good. Because I can't remember reading this. Do you want me to start, Charles?
Start with 36 and just stop when you feel like.
One of the...
1, 2, 3, 4, as many as you feel.
Okay. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to have dinner with him, so Jesus went to his home and sat down to eat. When a certain immoral woman from that city heard he was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar
yeah.
filled with expensive perfume. Then she knelt behind him at his feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She's a sinner." Then Jesus answered his thoughts. "Simon," he said to the Pharisee, "I have something to say to you." "Go ahead, teacher," Simon replied. Then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one, and 50 pieces to the other. But neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave them both, cancelled their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more after that? Simon answered, "I suppose the one for whom he cancelled the larger debt."
Good.
"That's right," Jesus said.
That's great. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, "Who is this, who even forgives sins?" Then he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." So here's Jesus. He goes into the house of a Pharisee, and as he's settled down for dinner, this lady comes in, who is effectively a prostitute, and she starts to wash Jesus' feet, and she starts to put this perfume on his feet. And then this other guy begins to say, well, hang on, how come Jesus, he claims to be this spiritual man, or he claims to be the Son of God, doesn't he know what sort of woman this woman is? And because he's allowing her to touch him, and signifying in some way that he should have separated himself from her. But actually, I can imagine Jesus' response would have been something more along the lines of, I actually know her, and that's the very reason why I'm engaging with her, because Jesus came not for the righteous, but he came for the unrighteous. And then she goes on to continue doing that. And then this guy, Simon, Jesus turns to him and says, look, Simon, I have a parable to tell you. If someone forgives you and your friend an amount of money, and the amount of money you're forgiven, you owe £500 and you owe £10, who's going to love the person who forgave more? And I think it became rather obvious, and he said the person who was forgiven the most. If you have been given forgiven debt of £500, you're more likely to respond positively to that individual compared to somebody who was forgiven £1 or £2. And that's the story Jesus was saying. And so the guy said, well, the person who was forgiven more. And so Jesus said, yeah, you're right. And he went on to talk about what the woman's response was, and went on to say at the end of all of that story that to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Now, take this back to the story of Mephibosheth we were talking about. Mephibosheth is forgiven a lot, and David did a lot for him. It is natural that he will then love David back. Now, here is saying, if you're forgiven this much, you love that much. If you're forgiven that much, you love that much. And then the story Jesus is speaking about here, it sort of strikes me, number one, that this guy, Pharisee, yes, he was a Pharisee, but in some way, it strikes me that maybe he had started to believe in Jesus. Because the parable that Jesus is telling him says two people have been forgiven. You see, one has been forgiven 500, one has been forgiven 10. The one who forgave 500 is now loving me much more than you who has been forgiven a little. Do you get that story? You get that sense from that parable? It seems a little bit of an odd parable for Jesus to tell to Simon, because he turned to Simon. He didn't tell it to the woman. He was telling it to Simon. He turned to Simon and he says, Simon, let me tell you something. If there are two people, there's two people in the room Jesus is referring to. One is forgiven much and one is forgiven little. In essence, he's saying, how will they love? One will love the more and one will love the less. The less. And that's the outcome. So I believe that this so-called Pharisee guy was actually believing in Jesus. So was this lady believing in Jesus as well. But one was pouring out her affection on Jesus out of her heart of love, knowing that she had been forgiven a lot. Because remember, your version called her an immoral lady. This one called her a sinner. Effectively, she was a prostitute. So she was forgiven, if you like, that kind of lifestyle. Whereas you have this guy who was a Pharisee, who typically are very religious and very, what's the word? At least outwardly, they don't do that kind of stuff. Yeah, they're very religious in their observances, and so on. So here you have that guy who's trusting in Jesus and loving Jesus in a particular way, and then you have this lady who is the outcast, who nobody even believes she should be touching Jesus, loving Jesus significantly. And then I asked myself, well, the Pharisee, though, couldn't change who he was. He was who he was when he met Jesus. And the lady was who she was when she met Jesus. So is he set at a disadvantage? Do you understand the point I'm making? Because now he's not forgiven very much, so he has no capacity to love much. So is the parable then saying, if I've not done a lot of wrong things, and I have a lot of wrong things to think about Jesus has forgiven me from, am I less likely, or is it harder for me to love than somebody who, say, was a gangster and had killed 3, 4, 5 people? What do you guys think Jesus is saying on this parable? That it's a very simple parable, I think. I think it's very straightforward. But how do you wrestle with that kind of thing? Do you think that could be the case? Is that the natural conclusion of that? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I guess for the women or someone like that, when you've experienced life a certain way and done certain things, and then I guess the grace that has been afforded to you is increased because of that, then because that debt has been paid, and that just there's more likely to be that instant gratitude. Whereas someone, if you haven't maybe necessarily had the life experiences where you've fallen on hard times or made decisions where you've kind of been able to get by yourself, and then the bad things you have done in that context are taken away, you don't have as much gratitude, just because in your sense there isn't as much to be forgiven because you've managed to get on by yourself.
So that's the natural response to that. Yeah, so I was thinking like that. Do you guys agree with what Rory is saying here? I was thinking like that. And then the next step of the thought process was, so in order to really appreciate Jesus, I'm going to live a life of sin. So it makes sense for me to get out there and do as much as I can do, and mess up as much as I can mess up myself and others. And then after all that, I will turn back to Jesus. He will show me grace and mercy, even if you don't do that with intent. The consequence is still the same. So somebody who is deliberate about sinning and doesn't care for Jesus, does that for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and then comes back, oh, Jesus, have mercy on me, and Jesus forgives him. That person's sin has set him or her up to love Jesus even more than the person who was resisting sin with all they had and trying to say, I'm not going to do this stuff, I'm not going to do this stuff, I'm not going to... Do you agree that that perverse outcome then becomes logical and rewarded? But we know that that's not the case, because sin is never rewarded. It never pays to sin more, if you like, whether openly or not openly. It never pays to do that. And so this got me thinking, well, I think you're entirely correct in your observation, because it's true. The issue, I think, here that Jesus is really trying to say, and this is the distinction, is saying the person who realizes that they have been forgiven much loves much. Not necessarily the person who has been forgiven much from an external appearance perspective. Do you know what I mean? It's easy to look at a prostitute and say, oh wow, Jesus has forgiven her from so much. But then the sort of monk, the guy who locked himself up in a monastery and lived there for 15, 20 years, never saw anyone else, but was committing all kinds of evil on a computer, could be just as bad, right? But nobody sees anything external, and maybe even he hasn't conducted such a sort of actively sinful life, but it's all been in the mind. And the other experience, I think, which we've touched on, is many times the church as a whole, and I speak holistically, doesn't actually, or shall I say, affirms this thing, because whenever you have somebody who comes to faith, who's killed, maybe not killed people, but have been in prison, did drugs and all kinds of stuff. When they come to Christ and they become saved, we get them out onto the pulpit to give their testimony, because their testimony is the really interesting one. But if we get someone who grew up and went through Raw, and then went through Mini Raw, they went to Alive or Pathfinders or whatever, then they went to Soul, and then they went to the CU in uni, and then they were in YAG, and then they got married, and they never did anything. We don't want to hear that guy's testimony, because it's kind of boring. There's no sort of sweet stories around that. Yeah, there's no, oh, I did this and I did that. No. Listen to my mom and dad. No. But are the experiences very different? Are they forgiven significantly more one than the other? And I'll tell you, I don't think so. Because sin is so grave, that it is so bad, that adding a tiny little bit to it, do you know what I mean? So yeah. if you take sin, the spectrum that we see in sin is like that, right? And you have the guys who don't kill people down here, and then the people who kill people up here. Yeah? You have them there. But that's the spectrum we see. Oh, okay, it's really bad. But to God, it's infinity. So sin is sin. If I stand so far back from something, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
It's one and the same. Otherwise, why did it take Jesus to die for you, who wasn't a gangster and didn't kill and wasn't a prostitute, for somebody who was? Why did it still take Jesus to die? Are you getting the point I'm making? The seriousness and the consequence of the sin. Now, there's grades, don't get me wrong, in there, but the headline consequence and the headline outcomes are exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And so the biggest problem for people who don't live overtly sinful lives is actually realizing in the first instance how much Jesus has actually forgiven them. And that was the issue with the Pharisee. Because he had lived a life of observances and doing the right thing, etc., etc., maybe he thought, oh, that was okay. Jesus just saved me from that little bit. Maybe I was okay. But Paul, who was a Pharisee, he called himself the chief of sinners. You know what I mean? So it is, for me, the real issue is us getting an understanding of, one, that we have sinned. Whether, would you agree with me, even if somebody grew up, as I said, in church from a baby up to whenever they grew up, at some point that person has to give their heart to Jesus. At some point, it may be that they do it when they're younger, it may be they do it when they're old, but at some point each individual has to commit their heart to Jesus. You may not be able to articulate the hour and the second as clearly as somebody else, but every one of us have to come to a point where we realize that actually we have sinned and we need Jesus. Mm-hmm. Because when you're kids and you're being taught this stuff, half the stuff goes over your head. It's just bits that sink in. But at some point you realize that, hang on, Jesus is real. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you make a decision for him. I mean, that's generally the experience of people who grow up in Christian homes. I've spoken to quite a number of folk like that. Sometimes they're going through the motions, but often they think, well, I don't really get it. But then there was a time that suddenly I got it. And this became really important to me. Mm-hmm. I think those testimonies should be celebrated as much as the grand testimony of the guy who killed 10 people and so on and has tattoos all over and is a gang member and all of this kind of stuff. We tend to like that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, it is not more of a miracle than the other testimony that we could tell. Mm-hmm. It's just like these two testimonies here, the lady and the Pharisee, they're exactly of equal worth and equal power, and both required Jesus to die, which meant that the sin was significant. And the sin was enough to take each of those individuals into eternal damnation and into eternal judgment. Jesus needed to die to rectify them. But so often we don't realize what Jesus has saved us from. We think, oh, he's just saved me to make my life better. That's not true. That's part of it. But he's actually saved us fundamentally from sin and from the judgment of sin. Mm-hmm. But in order to get there, we need to understand and appreciate actually what God has saved us from. And so often we don't really realize that. Because if we did, you would spend an awful lot of time thanking him, just like this lady. Mm-hmm. If you just settle down and think, well, where would I have been today if Jesus didn't intervene in my life? Where would I be in 20, 30 years' time if Jesus wasn't in my life? What could have happened to me? I could have died without faith. I could have died without believing in Jesus. All kinds of things could have happened. I never, at one point, believed in him. At one point, I thought all the guys who were Christians were just wasting their time. But in some way, he opened my eyes and caused me to actually see that there's nothing greater than Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I need him. And now what I need to keep reminding myself every day is how much it cost him. Why did it cost him that much? And how much he has saved me from. So my question to each of you then is, have you ever sat down to think, maybe during your prayer time, to think, now, what has God forgiven me from? I'm not talking about you itemizing, I did this and I stole from the money from the piggy box or whatever, all this sort of stuff. I'm talking about the stuff that you know is in you, where you have a propensity for evil. Allow God to shine the light on you, to show you that. Allow God to expose that to you, not because you're going to feel bad about it, but because you're going to feel great that, imagine, with all of this, God still welcomed me home. And he has called me his child. It's just like Mephibosheth. For Mephibosheth, it was obvious what his condition was. Yeah, remember he called himself a dead dog. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he knew what he was in that particular position. It was very obvious. But with sin, it's not always obvious to us what we are. But we have to ask the Holy Spirit to shine the light on us. It's not so we can be insular and focus on the sin. No, it's so that we can realize what Jesus has saved us from. Because when we realize what he's saved us from, we realize what he's done for us. When we realize what he's done for us, we realize how much he's loved us. When we realize how much he's loved us, the Bible says in 1 John 4:19, we love him because he first loved us. In the same way Jesus was describing, when you realize he's forgiven you from much, your response is to love him back a lot. Does this sort of stuff make sense?
Yeah.
Rather than us sitting thinking there's these grades of, if I'm forgiven all of that, then I'm at an advantage. No. There is no way sin gives us an advantage. There is no way sin gives anybody an advantage. Going out and doing things doesn't give us an advantage. And equally, remember, what is the most evil part of the human being? What is the bit that God really needed to deal with? It wasn't the things we were doing when we were sinning. It's actually our heart. So whether it was the lady who was the prostitute, her problem was her heart, not the stuff she was doing. It was her heart that needed forgiveness. But same with the Pharisee. He wasn't doing all that stuff outwardly, but his heart is still the same and still requires forgiveness. And it's how do you think we can get ourselves into a place where we can appreciate much better what Jesus has done for us, for you as an individual? What do you guys think? I'm not going to do all the talking now.
How best we can.
How do you think? So you've heard what we're saying now, getting into a place where we can appreciate. Because the Pharisee's problem was not that he was really forgiven a lot less than the lady. It's just that he didn't realize that he had been forgiven a lot less. That was his problem. Not that he had been, because Jesus telling him that doesn't change his life if there was nothing he could do about it. If it was, so be it, that's the way life is, then why is Jesus telling him that there's nothing he can do about it? But it was him Jesus was talking to. And I think what he was telling him was, go and realize how much I've forgiven you. And you will be able to love the same way this woman has loved me. Mm-hmm. And so the question for us then is, how do we get ourselves into a place where we can start to appreciate a lot better what Jesus has forgiven us from?
Talk to people and see what he's done in their lives, mm-hmm. and try to understand him more, how he works,
and reflect that back on your own life, because he's probably done something similar in your own life as well. Yeah, and
see what people Christians and non-Christians see if they've ever had an experience similar to what you've had, mm-hmm. and then try and link it to Jesus, because you might have done something bad, you might feel guilty about it, but then you might forget about it, and that could be Jesus forgiving you, and then it's less burden on you, but then you don't make the link.
Yeah.
But then if somebody's done the same sort of thing and it's Jesus working in their lives, maybe it's Jesus working in your life and you're just not making the link.
I think that's a really good point, is making the link, because what we don't want to do is going back and thinking about all the stuff we've done. And remember, it's not even so much about, the difficulty we've really got to get as Christians is understand the difference between things we do and who we are. Mm-hmm. Jesus didn't really die for the things that we did. He died for the people we were. We were sinners. Mm-hmm. Sinners sin. Mm-hmm. So it is natural to do those things. Yeah. So he died to save us from who we are, and that's why I like the point you made, creating the link between I've been forgiven from who I was, not the stuff I did. That's, don't get me wrong, that's important as well, but it's a consequence of who you are. Remember, we always have been saying here, don't try to be the light, for example. You act in a certain way because you are the light. Well, sin is exactly the same. We act out sin because we're sinners. We act out evil because we have evil in our heart. It's the same thing. So I think that's a good point. Creating that link between who we were and what Christ has done for us. And you can see that in other people.
Yeah.
And then you can relate that back to yourself. I think reading the Bible as well, and because you said seeing other people, well, reading the Bible is an opportunity to do that. You know, you may be reading the Bible and you see other people in similar situations and you think, well, I was like that. Mm-hmm. But I'm forgiven now. Jesus has taken that away. He has forgiven. You know, reading the Bible helps. And also the reading the Bible shines a certain light on us that shows us who we really are sometimes. You know, sometimes we have some, I don't know whether you've ever been in a position where you've come up with a thought. Maybe you guys are so holy, it doesn't happen to you, but you come up with a thought and then you think to yourself, man, where did that even come from? How could I come up with a thought like that? It's happened to me. I come up with whoa, where did that come from? That come from me? And it just shows us the capacity that we have for evil as human beings, but we are saved. Jesus has saved us from that stuff. But every now and again, he shines the light on it to show us who we are. Like if I snap at somebody or I shout at somebody in a moment of anger or something like that, thinking, whoa, that stuff is still in me. It's not gone anywhere. And then that reminds me when I link it back and say, well, that's the person Jesus has saved me from. I think it's really important. Otherwise, we will walk through life not really appreciating him for what he's done for us. Because we think, oh, for me, it wasn't great job. It was just turning over a new leaf. Yeah? But for that guy, it was a whole new book, a whole new volume for his life. But me, it was just a simple page because my life was okay. That's a lie. Your life was never okay. Even if you grew up in a Christian home, your life was never okay. Your heart was not okay. Jesus needed to die for you. If everybody grew up in and lived a straight life, Jesus would still need to die for each one of those individuals. It was still required because it's about the heart.
Another thing that we should do is try and understand what sin is. Like, sin is sin.
Yeah.
No matter if I went out and killed 10 people or Rory stole a cookie from the cookie jar, it's still sin.
Yeah, that's very true.
So we need to understand that a bit more and learn
That's
about
very
it
true.
more.
That's
And
very
talk
true.
about it with people, like what Jesus does in our lives. Tell people that I've been forgiven for stealing a cookie.
Or killing somebody.
Or killing somebody.
No, I think that's back to the spectrum
I
point.
thought it'd be nice and give you the cookie, Rory.
I appreciated it.
Back to the spectrum point. Yeah, you kill somebody, you're up here. Steal a cookie, you're down here.
Yeah.
But the further away you move from it, it blurs into one line.
Yeah.
It's all sin. Yeah, and sin is missing the mark. Whether you miss it by this or you miss it by that, you miss the mark. Jesus needed to die for us in those contexts. So I think that's a really, really powerful point. Because too often we think that's just a little. It's like like the white lie thing.
Yeah.
Just a little white lie. No, a lie is a lie, and a lie is missing the mark, and a lie is sin. That's the bottom line. If you just call it a white lie, you're justifying and you're excusing it. It is sin.
It was just a wee cookie.
I know, exactly. And nobody wanted it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I wanted the cookie.
You wanted it, so it was...
To make the sin worse, you steal the cookie and then you replace it. That makes it worse. Because then you just live with it, even though you replaced it.
I saw somebody do something really... Can you delete this one? I saw somebody do something that was really weird. I've never seen someone go to this extent.
Oh no.
It's not terrible in the sense it's not graphic or anything. Bought a pair of trainers. Please delete this one.
Yeah.
Bought a pair of trainers. Saw them elsewhere cheaper.
Oh.
Had worn them. Saw them cheaper. Bought the cheaper ones.
To them back to the shop.
No. The person was kind enough not to give back the ones that they'd been wearing, but swapped them out. So put the new ones back in the expensive box and took the expensive box back. You get it?
That's just shrewd shopping.
Is that sin?
I think that's deception. You're not
Wait, I
giving
don't
back
get-
what you bought. You are not giving back what
How
you
much
bought.
time were we talking?
Sorry?
Between...
Oh, she'd warned that this is like... It doesn't matter, it's a week or something like that.
Wait, what's this? I'm so confused.
So, there's one shop
That's wrong. It's
sell-
deception.
selling one pair of shoes for like £50.
Yeah.
And then another shop selling it for £15. She bought them a week before at the £50 shop.
I think it's a week, but a while. I don't know what it was.
And then saw them in the £15 shop. So bought the £15 ones, put them in the box of her £50 version, pulled it up and gave it back to the £50 shop saying, I don't like them, can I get my money back? They give her the money back. So
She's quit sin.
she's paid £65 for both of them, but she's got 50 back from the...
I don't...
But they're both the same.
That's deception.
Really?
There's no way you can say that you have not given back
But
what
you
bought.
can give back even if
Yeah,
there's
you've
nothing
not-
physically
You can,
wrong.
you can.
But
If
like-
the shop would accept it,
But
the
then
fact that you
you've not
swapped
given
them.
back the shoes. Even
Yes,
if it's
exactly.
like
You've
not
given a
given back.
different pair of shoes back.
Were they
But,
the same
yeah.
design and same like
I'm
make
sure
and
they
same
were.
colour?
I think they were.
From
They
the
must have
shop's perspective, though, would they rather have like a never worn new pair or a
What
pair
would
that someone's
Jesus do?
worn for a week?
What would Jesus? Do you think Jesus would do that?
I don't think Jesus would buy the 15.
No,
Jesus
even if he bought. Let's say he did
Jesus
it
wear
with a
shoes?
carpenter's tool, with some sort of hammer.
Was there
Jesus
shoes
would not
back
do that.
2,000 years ago. I didn't think Jesus would buy shoes.
Sandals.
Sandals.
Oh, okay.
Remember,
He's got Clark's and he's got Asda. He buys them from Clark's and then he sees them in Asda for...
It's for me. I mean, yes,
Two
it's this
silver
convoluted
pieces.
sort of thing. I couldn't find myself. I couldn't do it.